Before this story unfolds, I need to ask you something. Have you ever felt guided by something you couldn't explain? Have you experienced a moment when faith, miracles, or divine intervention changed everything? If you believe in second chances, redemption, and the power of spiritual transformation, then you're in the right place. On this channel, we share stories that touch the soul stories of people who encountered the divine, found grace in their darkest moments, and discovered that miracles are real. This is one of those stories. Subscribe now and join our community of believers, seekers, and dreamers. Enable notifications so you never miss a story that could change how you see faith, love, and redemption. Because the best stories are the ones that remind us we're never truly alone. The highway stretched before them like an endless dark ribbon that seemed to have no end. The old sedan's engine hummed with a tired tone, and the wind battering the windows created a constant background to the harsh words filling the interior. Sarah kept her hands firmly on her lap, gripping her skirt tightly, while her gaze was lost in the darkness beyond the glass. "Always the same, James," she said, her voice broken by anger and exhaustion. "Steering
You
wheel,
always spend more
eyes
than we
fixed
have."
on the asphalt." He gripped the, "And what did you want me to do? Let the shop truck break down? Without that job, we don't eat." Sarah huffed and turned her face toward the window. Outside, moonlight barely revealed silhouettes of scattered trees and hills that seemed to sleep under a gray blanket. The argument had started before they left Phoenix, but the confinement of the car and the hours of driving had turned it into an uncontrolled fire. Faded road signs announcing detours and ghost towns passed slowly, as if the highway was mocking them. There were no lights in the distance, no houses, no music, except for the radio static. The air inside the car felt dense, heavier than normal. "My mother always said you don't travel at night, especially not on these old roads," Mariana murmured more to herself than to him. James let out a short laugh, loaded with disbelief. "Here we go again with those stories. Ghosts, miracles, pure nonsense to scare people." She looked at him hurt. By his tone, "I'm not talking about scaring. I'm talking about respecting. Things have happened here that neither you nor I can explain." Silence settled again, broken only by the monotonous beating of the tires. Sarah remembered her mother's words. "If the road ever feels darker than normal, don't keep going without praying." She wasn't especially superstitious, but since childhood she'd felt a deep connection to her faith, a comfort James never fully understood. A sign bent by time announced, "Phoenix, 120 miles. Still a long way to go, and the gas gauge showed just over a quarter tank. The wind blew harder, lifting swirls of dust that hit the car like small stones. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, seeking calm. She thought about recent weeks, work, debts, cold looks at the dinner table. Something was breaking between them, and though they denied it, both knew it. James broke the silence. "Look, it's not that I don't value what you do. I know you work hard, that you worry about us, but I'm exhausted too." She opened her eyes and observed him sideways. In his voice was a tone she hadn't heard in a long time, sincerity without anger. "I just want us to stop feeling like we're alone in this." Their eyes met briefly before a pothole jolted the car. The radio, as if reacting, stopped emitting static and picked up a deep male voice reciting a passage from the gospel. The coincidence made them both fall silent. "Blessed are those who trust, for they shall not walk in darkness," said the firm, clear voice. James swallowed hard, trying not to give it importance, but Sarah straightened in her seat, alert. Something in her chest began beating with force, as if those words were not coincidence. The night continued wrapping around them, and though the road seemed the same as always, a strange premonition began to be born in the heavy air of the car. If you believe in miracles, stay tuned, because what's about to happen will change everything forever. Subscribe now and join us on this journey. The silence that voice had left on the radio became heavier than the previous argument. James tried to turn the dial to change stations, but only found more static. The night seemed to swallow any signal. Sarah, with her gaze fixed on the windshield, noticed that the beam of light from the headlights barely reached the white line in the center of the road. The asphalt showed deep cracks and old patches that forced James to maneuver carefully. On each side, trees and cacti formed twisted shadows that seemed to move with the wind. In the distance, a rusty sign hung from a single bolt, swaying slowly. It read, San Juan del Rio, in almost erased letters. "See," Sarah murmured. "Even the signs seem abandoned. It's just an old road," he replied, trying to sound sure, but his tense hands on the steering wheel betrayed him. They passed a closed gas station. The roof was covered with loose sheets that tapped gently against each other. The price sign was so faded that the numbers were indistinguishable. Next to the pumps, a skinny dog watched them pass without moving, as if sculpted in the shadows. The wind increased, lifting dust that seeped through the car's gaps, bringing an aroma of dry earth mixed with something metallic. Sarah adjusted in her seat and crossed her arms. "I'm telling you, James, I don't like this road. I feel like we're being watched." He let out a brief snort. "The only thing watching us is hunger and sleep. In half an hour, we reach a town and rest." But looking at the dashboard, Sarah saw the gas needle had dropped more than expected. "We won't make it that fast if we keep going like this," she said, unable to hide her worry. The radio suddenly let out a sharp, metallic screech. James turned it off with a slap of his hand. The silence returned, but it was different. Not the calm of night, but a strange void, as if even the insects had stopped singing. They passed a small chapel on the edge of the road. A candle flickered inside, projecting a shadow over an image of the Virgin Mary. Sarah kept looking until the light faded behind him. "You know, my mom used to tell me there are highways where the saints care for travelers and others where all you find are lost souls." James didn't respond. A sharp curve appeared unexpectedly, forcing him to brake. The tires squealed on the asphalt, and for an instant, Sarah's heart jumped. When they resumed, she noticed her breathing was accelerated. "You have to slow down," she sighed quietly. "If I slow down more, we'll never get out of here," he replied, though he'd already eased off the accelerator. A few meters ahead, a wooden sign warned, "Detour in 5 kilometers." The letters were handwritten, as if a neighbor had placed it. It seemed strange to James, but he said nothing. The dust kept accumulating on the windshield, and the previously visible moon was hidden behind thick clouds. The road became even darker, as if the car's lights weren't enough to pierce the blackness. Sarah swallowed hard, feeling a knot in her stomach. At that moment, the memory of her mother's warnings returned with more force. "If the night feels different, it's because something is looking for you." Sarah shivered, but didn't want to speak anymore. James looked in the rearview mirror. Behind them, the road was completely empty, not a light nor a glimmer in the distance. Though they didn't say it, both began to feel that the road was more than just a stretch of asphalt. It was something more, something that seemed to have a life of its own. The wind blew in colder gusts, as if the temperature had suddenly dropped. James frowned and turned on the high beams to try to see better. The asphalt stretched empty, but on the horizon, a silhouette began to take shape. First, it was an immobile point lost in the darkness. Then, as the car advanced, it took form. Sarah, looking distractedly out the window, sat up with a start. "James, do you see that?" He looked at her for an instant, then turned his attention back to the road. Must be someone walking, maybe a farmer heading home, but the figure didn't move. It remained in the same place, right in the middle of the road. It wore something light, a tunic that seemed to glow faintly, even without direct light. What was strange was that wind was lifting dust around it, but its clothes remained motionless, as if separated from the world. James slowed down, but the beating in his temples accelerated. Sarah dug her nails into her skirt, unable to take her eyes off that presence. "I don't like this," she whispered. The car approached slowly, the headlights bathing the figure in light. That's when Sarah noticed something impossible to ignore. The face was illuminated in a way that didn't correspond to the direction of the light. There were no shadows on its features, as if the clarity came from within. James braked abruptly, stopping the car about 30 feet away. The screech of brakes echoed in the empty night. The figure remained there, looking toward them with a serene and penetrating expression. The air inside the car changed. A faint aroma of incense filtered through, without any windows being open. Sarah inhaled with a shiver, immediately remembering the masses of her childhood. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. James swallowed. "Nothing. We keep going. It's probably just some crazy person." But when he put his hand on the gear shift, the figure took a step forward. It wasn't a sudden or threatening movement. It was slow, but charged with a presence so intense that James became paralyzed. Sarah noticed that the fear she felt mixed with a strange peace, as if a part of her recognized something in that face. "Wait," she said, placing a hand on James's arm. "Don't be afraid. I don't think it wants to hurt us." He turned his head toward her, incredulous. "You're listening to yourself, right?" "Yes." Her voice sounded more firm. "I really don't think it wants to hurt us." James's heart beat with force, but his breathing began to accompany itself, without knowing why. Outside, the figure stopped a few steps away, raised one hand in a clear gesture of calm. Then, without opening his mouth, a voice resonated inside both of them, as if it didn't enter through the ears, but directly into thought. "Do not fear." James jumped and looked at Sarah, who watched him with wide eyes. "You heard that?" She nodded, unable to articulate a word. For an instant, time seemed to stop. Sound of wind disappeared. The night became dense, and only the three of them existed on that forgotten stretch of road. The figure held their gaze, and an inexplicable feeling of security spread in Sarah's chest. James, without fully understanding, slowly released the steering wheel, as if an invisible force was telling him there was no rush, that he should listen. Whatever they were witnessing was unlike anything they'd experienced before. The air seemed to have stopped. Neither the chirp of crickets nor the whisper of wind could break that silence that squeezed their chests. James kept his hands tense on the steering wheel, as if gripping it was the only thing keeping him anchored. Sarah breathed slowly, feeling that each inhalation carried a mix of fear and strange serenity. The figure remained motionless, just a few steps in front of the car. Its eyes, dark but full of unusual brightness, were fixed on them. Suddenly, its voice was heard clearly, as if speaking just beside them, though the lips barely moved. "Do not fear?" James shuddered. "You heard that?" he asked in barely a whisper. "Yes," answered Sarah without looking away. "I'm serious, James." The man, if that's what he was, raised his hand slightly, not as an order, but as a gesture of peace. The aroma of incense intensified, bringing to Sarah's memory the Holy Week processions in her hometown. She, driven by something stronger than fear, opened the car door. The sound of metal moving was almost offensive in that silence. "What are you doing?" exclaimed James, surprised. "Close the door." "No, I want to see him closer." Sarah took a step outside, feeling dust crunch under her shoes. The air was cool. It seemed to carry a strange weight, as if every particle was charged with meaning. She took a couple steps, and the figure looked at her with a warmth that reminded her of her father, who had died years ago. "Who are you?" she asked with a trembling voice. The figure smiled barely, as if the question didn't need an answer. James, seeing that Sarah wasn't returning, got out of the car cautiously. His instinct told him to keep his distance, but an unexpected curiosity pushed him forward. "What do you want from us?" he asked, trying to sound firm. The answer came with calm. "Only that you trust." Sarah felt those words pierce her heart. They didn't sound like an order, but like an invitation. She looked at James, who seemed to wrestle between distrust and a new sensation he couldn't name. The silence returned, but this time it wasn't oppressive. It was as if the entire world had paused to give them that instant. "James," whispered Sarah, "I think we should listen to him." He turned his gaze away, pressing his lips. "I don't know. This isn't normal." Precisely because of that, she took another step toward the figure. "Maybe it's not about what we understand, but about what we need." James remained motionless, his breathing accelerated. For the first time in a long time, he felt vulnerable, exposed, as if that presence could see every corner of his soul. The figure raised its hand again, and a slight murmur began to fill the air. They weren't clear words, but the rhythm and cadence reminded them of an ancient prayer. Sarah closed her eyes and let the sound wrap around her. She felt a gentle warmth in her chest, a peace she hadn't experienced in years. James, without realizing it, took a step forward. He didn't understand why, but there was something in that voice that stripped away the defenses he always kept up. When the murmur ceased, the figure lowered its hand slowly. Not another word left its lips, but both knew they should remain there, alert, as if something important was about to be revealed. The silence returned deep and expectant, and both felt the entire night was holding its breath with them. Suddenly, a distant noise began to grow from the road behind them. It was a deep, metallic roar that mixed with a constant screech. Sarah turned her head and saw in the distance the lights of a truck coming at full speed. There was nothing strange about that until they realized the vehicle seemed out of control. "James!" exclaimed Sarah with her heart racing. "It's not braking." He reacted immediately, running toward the car. The truck's lights approached like two flames devouring the darkness. The sound of the engine, at full throttle, made the ground beneath their feet vibrate. "Get in!" shouted James, opening the driver's door. But when he turned, the sedan's engine coughed and refused to start. Sarah, desperate, hit the dashboard. "Come on, please." The truck was seconds away from reaching them. They could see the driver's figure moving frantically, trying something that wasn't working. It was then that the figure, that luminous presence, extended both arms toward them. "Trust," it said with a firm voice that left no room for doubt. At that instant, the car, without James turning the key again, started with a sudden roar. The headlights illuminated a side path, and an invisible force seemed to push the vehicle toward a small space off the road. James turned the wheel hard, and the sedan slid over the dusty ground. A second later, the truck passed at full speed where they'd been, its wheels grazing the edge of the asphalt before crashing into a small hill a few meters ahead. The crash shook the air, and the smell of hot metal and burned brakes filled everything. Sarah covered her mouth, trembling. "If we hadn't moved, ... James breathed with difficulty, staring at where the truck had ended up, tilted on its side. The driver wasn't moving, but there were no flames, just dense smoke rising in spirals. Both looked toward where the figure had been. Surprisingly, it was still there in the middle of the road, as if nothing had happened. Neither the noise nor the violence of the moment seemed to have affected it. Sarah felt a chill. It wasn't fear, but a certainty that went to her bones. This wasn't just an encounter. There was a reason they were alive. James got out of the car, still agitated. He walked a few steps toward the figure without knowing what to say. "Why?" His voice broke, unable to finish the question. The figure simply looked at him and repeated with an impossibility of serenity in the middle of that chaos. "Trust." Sarah got out slowly. united with James by that mix of disbelief and gratitude that neither could yet process. She felt her legs trembling, but the presence of that being gave her a strange strength. The wind blew softly again, as if the night was recovering its normal course. In the distance, the truck's engine sputtered, dying little by little. James and Sarah looked at each other. Neither had the right words for what had just happened. However, both knew they'd passed a test, and that it wouldn't be the last. The smoke from the truck began to dissipate in the distance, but the metallic smell still floated in the air. James kept looking at the accident site, trying to understand how they'd come away unscathed. Sarah, on the other hand, kept her gaze fixed on the figure, as if the rest of the world had ceased to exist. The presence moved slowly toward them, without making noise on the asphalt. There was no urgency in its steps, but each movement seemed to carry an immense weight. When it was close enough, it observed both with a deep gaze, almost paternal. "You have forgotten what it means to walk together," it said with a measured voice. Sarah felt those words pierce her defenses. She placed a hand on her chest and swallowed hard. Who are you?" "I am who comes to remind you of what you have lost," it replied. James frowned, uneasy. "And what exactly have we lost?" The figure didn't look away from him. "Trust, respect, the will to bear one another's weight." Sarah looked down. Those words were like an uncomfortable mirror, reflecting everything they'd let break. She remembered recent arguments, cold looks at the table, the times they chose, silence instead of resolving what could be fixed. James wanted to respond with some excuse, but the firm voice stopped him before he could speak. "Pride is a wall you have built yourselves, and when the wall grows, you can no longer see each other." The air around seemed warmer now, and the aroma of incense intensified. Sarah lifted her eyes with tears accumulating. "I don't want to keep living like this." James looked at her sideways. He wasn't used to hearing her speak with such vulnerability, out loud, and that made him uncomfortable, but it also awakened something in him. The figure smiled slightly, as if that small admission was a first step. "It is not enough to want. You must choose every day to listen to each other, to care for each other, to walk side by side." The silence returned, but it was full of an unspoken message, of an invitation to look inward. Sarah took a step toward James. "I know I'm not perfect, and that I've held grudges, but I don't want to lose you." He breathed deeply, avoiding her eyes for a moment. "I don't want to lose you either, though I'm not sure I know how to change." "It's not about knowing," said the figure. "It's about doing it." The phrase fell like an absolute truth neither could argue with. And without planning it, their hands sought and found each other in the middle of the night. It was a small gesture, but loaded with meaning. The figure nodded as if approving the moment, and pointed to a side road barely distinguishable among the brush. "Follow that. It will lead you to a place where wounds begin to close." James squinted, trying to make out something in the darkness. "Where does it lead? Where exactly?" "Where you need to be tonight," it answered without further explanation. Sarah looked at James, seeking an answer. He hesitated for a few seconds, but finally nodded. "All right, we'll go." The figure took a step back, as if its role there had ended. "Do not separate from each other. The road is safe if you walk together." With those words, it turned slowly toward the darkness of the highway. Sarah felt an impulse to call out, to ask for more, but something inside told her she shouldn't. Both got in the car, still holding hands, and turned onto the indicated path. As the tires left the asphalt to venture onto that unknown road, Sarah felt that perhaps for the first time in a long while they were going in the right direction. The indicated path opened between low shrubs and scattered trees, with loose, earth-forming clouds of dust behind the tires. The engine noise felt stronger in the midst of that rural silence. Sarah kept her eyes forward, trying to guess what awaited them, while James held the steering wheel with both hands, alert. I didn't know there were roads like this around here, he said, breaking the silence. Maybe it's not a road that appears on maps, replied Sarah, with a tone mixing curiosity and caution. The moon, filtered through scattered clouds, lit enough for them to distinguish the vegetation on the sides. Occasionally, a cricket interrupted the quiet with its song, but the atmosphere remained charged with a strange calm, as if everything was prepared for their arrival. After a few minutes, small lights began to appear in the distance. They were faint, as if coming from ancient lanterns. The air changed, bringing with it an aroma of toasted corn and burning wood. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment and smiled softly. It smells like the fairs in my hometown. As they drew closer, they saw the first houses' adobe constructions with tiled roofs, some with whitewashed walls that reflected the light of oil lamps hanging on the doors. In a corner, a couple of farmers rested beside a barrow loaded with sacks. An older man in a wide hat raised his hand to greet them. James rolled down the window slightly. "Good evening," he said. "Good evening, young man," replied the old man with a raspy voice. "It's not common to see outsiders at this hour. We're just passing through. Is this the way to San Miguel del Milagro?" asked James. The man nodded slowly. "Yes, but not many come this way at night." "You must have a good reason." Sarah hesitated before responding. "Someone indicated this path to us. Someone special." The old man exchanged a look with his companion, and then smiled as if he'd understood more than it seemed. "Well, welcome then. Keep straight and you'll reach the plaza." They thanked him and continued. As they approached the center, more people appeared. A group of women sat at the entrance of a house weaving baskets, and children played in the light of a small fire. Everyone watched them with a mix of curiosity and cordiality, as if they knew these weren't mere travelers. At a corner, a gray-haired woman offered them a jar of fresh water and a plate with freshly baked bread. Sarah accepted gratefully and felt the warmth of the bread in her hands. "Do they always receive people this way?" she asked. The woman looked her in the eyes. "Not always. Only when it's important that they arrive safely." That answer made Sarah swallow hard, and she noticed James had also frowned, intrigued. They continued until the road opened into a cobblestone plaza, presided over by an ancient church. A wrought iron cross rose in the center, and the soft tolling of a bell resonated through the night, marking an hour neither bothered to check. James stopped the car and turned off the engine. "Well, we've arrived," Sarah observed the church, with a feeling of anticipation. She didn't know what they'd find inside, but something told her the answer to everything they'd lived through that night was closer than ever. The distant murmur of the town mixed with the call of a rooster that inexplicably announced the arrival of something they still couldn't comprehend. The plaza of San Miguel was quiet, lit by lanterns that cast a soft glow on the ancient stones. The aroma of fresh flowers drifted from a small altar decorated with candles that trembled in the night breeze. Sarah descended with cautious steps, observing every detail, while James closed the door with a dull sound that echoed in the silence. A couple of men conversed on a bench, smoking cigarettes, and turned their heads to look at the newcomers. Further on, an elderly woman dressed in a dark shawl exited the church holding a rosary. She walked hunched, but with a bearing that transmitted respect. Sarah, without thinking too much, approached her. "Good evening, ma'am." The old woman looked at her with clear, bright eyes, then at James, as if evaluating something in his interior. "Good evening, child. Visitors don't usually arrive at this hour. We're just passing through," said Sarah, "but we saw someone on the road who indicated we should come here." The old woman's eyes opened slightly, and a sigh escaped her lips. "Someone. It's been many years since I heard anyone describe him that way." James crossed his arms, skeptical. "Who exactly is this person? Supposed to be?" The woman turned her head toward the church. "Inside, on the side altar, there's an ancient painting. The face you're describing is the same one painted by a craftsman more than a century ago. Inspired, they say, by a vision he had right here in this plaza. Sarah felt a chill. And who do you think it is? It doesn't matter what I believe, child, replied the old woman. What matters is what you felt tonight. The woman continued her way slowly, disappearing into one of the cobblestone streets. James and Sarah stood in silence, processing her words. This is starting to seem too strange, muttered James. Strange? Replied Sarah. I'd say miraculous. As they conversed, a child approached running with a shy smile. He carried a bouquet of wildflowers in his hands. Grandmother says these are for you. For us? Asked Sarah, surprised. The boy nodded. She said that whenever someone arrives at night, guided by him, they should receive something that blooms in the desert. Sarah took the bouquet, feeling the delicate perfume of the flowers, and smiled at him. Thank you, little one. The boy ran back toward a nearby house, while James watched him leave. This is already too much. Maybe it's not too much, said Sarah, caressing the petals. Maybe it's exactly what we needed to see in order to believe. At that moment, the church bells rang 3 times. They weren't regular hourly chimes. The rhythm was slower, solemn. The temple door remained half open, and warm light filtered from within. Sarah took a step forward. I'm going in. James looked at her uncertainly, but finally sighed and followed her. The night breeze became softer, and an expectant silence seemed to wrap around the plaza as they crossed the threshold. What they would find inside was yet to be revealed, but deep in their hearts, they already knew that place held answers to the questions they'd avoided for too long. The penumbra inside the church was softly broken by the light of dozens of candles. The smell of melted wax and fresh flowers impregnated the air, mixing with a distant echo that seemed to come from the very walls. Sarah advanced slowly through the central aisle, brushing the fingertips of her hand along the pews polished by years. James walked behind, looking around cautiously, as if searching for a logical explanation for every detail. On one side of the main altar, a low door led to a side chapel. The light emanating from there was more intense, as if naturally attracting visitors. Crossing the threshold, Sarah stopped in her tracks. Before her, hanging on a stone wall, was a large painting. It depicted a man with a serene face, light tunic, and deep, searching gaze. The painting, though old, held a strange brightness, as if colors resisted the passage of time. Him, whispered Sarah, feeling a knot form in her throat. James, it's the same one we saw on the road. He approached, observing each brushstroke. The resemblance is impressive, but it doesn't make sense. A tall man with graying hair and a black cassock appeared from the back of the chapel. His steps were peaceful, and his hands rested on a rosary. Good evening, he said with a grave but kind voice. I'm Father Ignacio. I see you found the portrait. Sarah nodded without taking her eyes off the painting. We saw him, or found him. I'm not sure how to say it. In the middle of the road he spoke to us, and saved us from an accident. The priest's brow furrowed slightly, though a glimmer of recognition appeared in his eyes. You're not the first to say something like that. The history of this portrait is known here, though few take it seriously. James crossed his arms. What history? Father Ignacio moved closer, placing a hand on the carved wooden frame. More than a century ago, a traveler got lost in these lands during a storm. He said a luminous figure guided him to the village, and here, in this very chapel, he found refuge. He had this painting, commissioned so everyone would remember his face. Since then, some assure that he appears to those in danger to show them the way. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. And do you believe that? The priest smiled slightly. I've heard too many similar testimonies to think they're mere coincidences. But faith is a step each one must decide to take. James looked at the painting again. The serenity in the painted man's expression was identical to what he'd felt when the figure spoke to them. Yet his mind searched for a more earthly explanation, even though it was becoming increasingly difficult to find one. "Whatever it may be," added Father Ignacio, "what matters is what it provokes in you. If it inspires you to change, to heal, then its purpose is already being fulfilled." Sarah looked down, moved by the calm in the priest's words. James breathed deeply, feeling that night was breaking down barriers he built over years. Father Ignacio observed both with attention. "I believe there is more you need to say to each other, but also more you need to hear." A deep silence settled in the chapel. The portrait seemed to watch them, not with judgment, but with infinite patience. At that moment, James knew this conversation was just beginning, and the true weight of what they'd lived was yet to be revealed. The penumbra of the chapel wrapped around James and Sarah as Father Ignacio remained standing before them, hands interlaced over his rosary. The silence, barely broken by the creak of ancient wood, seemed to demand they speak. "There's something we haven't said," began James, his voice low, as if each word cost him enormous effort. Sarah looked at him in surprise at his tone. "What?" He clenched his jaw, avoiding her eyes. "I'm not the man I've appeared to be. Not only have I been proud and stubborn, I've failed you in the worst way." The echo of his words hung suspended in the air. Sarah felt her stomach clench. "What are you talking about?" James breathed deeply, as if preparing to receive a blow. "A year ago, I was involved with someone else. It wasn't long, but it existed. I let the distance between us, my ego, carry me away, and I never had the courage to tell you." Sarah closed her eyes hard, trying to contain the trembling of her hands. The wound opened suddenly, without anesthesia. "And you're telling me this now?" "Here?" Her voice carried more pain than anger. "Because here I feel I can't hide anything," he said. James swallowed, hard. "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want you to know the truth." Father Ignacio moved a step closer, observing them with seriousness. "Truth, though painful, is always the first brick for rebuilding what has crumbled." Sarah looked at him with tears in her eyes. "And how do you rebuild something broken like that?" "With humility, child," replied the priest, and with a firm decision not to hurt again. James felt the weight in his chest becoming unbearable. "I can't change what I did, but I can change what I am from now on, if you'll still let me try." Sarah moved away a few steps, hugging herself. She remembered the cold nights, the endless arguments, the suspicions she'd buried. Part of her wanted to scream and leave, but another deeper part remembered the moment when the figure on the road told them to trust. Father Ignacio broke the silence. "Sometimes God allows certain truths to surface at the exact moment the heart is ready to receive them." "Not before," Sarah breathed, in an agitated manner. Finally, she looked at James. "I don't know if I can forgive you now, but I know I don't want to keep living with resentment." Her words were sincere, though they didn't promise immediate reconciliation. James nodded, accepting that this was already more than he deserved. "That is enough to begin," said the priest with a slight smile. "Forgiveness is a journey, not an instant." The night was colder when James and Sarah exited the church. The clear sky revealed a blanket of stars that seemed to extend infinitely above the town. They walked in silence, each trapped in their own thoughts, yet with the feeling that something invisible continued guiding their steps. Arriving at the car, Sarah opened the passenger door and froze. On the back seat, perfectly placed in the center, was a small wooden crucifix so polished it seemed freshly carved. "James," she said quietly, "did you leave this here?" He frowned and shook his head. "No, and the last time we were in the car, there was nothing here." Sarah took the cross in her hands. The touch was warm, as if exposed to the sun, and from it emanated a faint aroma of incense. Her fingers traced the wood grain, feeling a peace that contrasted with the turmoil inside since James's confession. It's like ... she murmured without daring to finish the phrase. ... like we were left it, completed James, looking at her steadily. Both knew who could have done it, though they didn't say it aloud. They understood that this wasn't just an ordinary object, but a reminder of what they'd lived. They got in the car, and as James started the engine, a slight breeze moved through the interior, bringing again that unmistakable aroma of incense. There were no open windows. Sarah pressed the cross against her chest and closed her eyes. She remembered the voice she'd heard on the road, the calm gesture of the figure, how everything had changed since that moment. She felt this object was not just a gift, but a silent promise that they weren't alone. James, focused on the steering wheel, spoke little, but his mind replayed everything that had occurred, the appearance, the avoided accident, the words in the church, and now this. Something in him was beginning to break down the wall of disbelief he'd built over years. "Sarah," he said suddenly, "I don't know whether to believe in miracles or not, but I know this isn't coincidence." She opened her eyes and looked at him softly. "You don't have to understand it all right. Now, just don't close your heart." He nodded slightly, not looking away from the road. For several minutes they traveled without speaking, each holding in silence what the night had revealed. Then something strange happened. The dashboard flickered for an instant, and the radio, which was off, emitted a brief interference. Among the noise emerged a phrase, clear, spoken by a calm masculine voice. "Trust." James and Sarah looked at each other with the same start. "Did you hear that?" he asked. "Yes," she replied, feeling a chill. The signal disappeared as quickly as it had come. The engine continued functioning normally, and the road stretched ahead calmly, as if nothing had happened. But neither could deny what they'd heard. James smiled slightly, a small gesture but sincere. "Maybe it really was a miracle." Sarah didn't respond. She simply took his hand over the gear shift and held it without letting go, the cross resting between her fingers. And so, with hearts a bit lighter, they continued driving toward the unknown, knowing that the night had not finished writing their story. The road that opened before them seemed different from the one they traveled earlier. Though old, the asphalt reflected moonlight in a brightness, and on both sides extended silent fields covered in long shadows. The constant engine sound and the gentle friction of tires on pavement were their only companions. Sarah maintained a firm grip on the cross, while James kept one hand on the wheel and the other holding hers. The night was no longer oppressive, but somehow protective, as if the very road had transformed into a silent witness to their journey toward healing. Ahead, the horizon began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, and both knew that whatever awaited them on the other side of this night, they would face it together, no longer as two lost souls on a desert road, but as two people who had been given a second chance by something neither could fully explain, but both had learned to trust.